The autumn wind swept across the desolate plains of New Mexico territory, carrying with it the scent of sage and the whispered prayers of a woman whose heart had been carved hollow by loss. In the small wooden chapel that stood like a forgotten sentinel against the endless sky, Margaret O'Sullivan knelt before a simple wooden cross, her blonde hair catching the last rays of sunlight that filtered through the cracked windows. "Make me a mother, God," she whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of years of unanswered prayers. "Please, I beg of you, take this emptiness from my womb and fill it with life." Her hands gripped the worn wooden pew until her knuckles turned white, and tears carved clean paths down her dust-stained cheeks. The chapel, built by her late husband Thomas 3 years before his death, had become her sanctuary of sorrow. Every evening, as the sun painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, she would come here to plead with the heavens for the one thing that had been denied to her throughout her marriage. Margaret was 28 years old, but the harsh frontier life had etched lines of premature aging around her green eyes. Her husband had died in a mining accident 2 years ago, leaving her alone on their small homestead with nothing but memories and an aching void where children should have been. The other settlers whispered that perhaps it was God's will, that some women were simply not meant to bear children, but Margaret refused to accept such cruel fate. Hey there, friend. Before we continue with Margaret's story, I'd love for you to subscribe to our channel if you're enjoying these tales from the Old West. And tell me, what city are you watching from? I always love hearing from folks all across the country who share our passion for these frontier stories. Unknown to Margaret, her desperate prayers had drawn an unexpected witness. Standing in the shadow of a towering saguaro cactus, barely 50 yards from the chapel, was a figure that seemed to emerge from the very essence of the desert itself. Ayanna, whose name meant eternal blossom in his native tongue, was a warrior of the Chiricahua Apache, a man whose bronze skin bore the scars of countless battles and whose dark eyes held the wisdom of the ancient mountains. He had been tracking a wounded deer when the sound of the woman's voice carried on the evening wind had stopped him in his tracks. The Apache understood many languages, including the English spoken by the white settlers, and her words struck something deep within his chest. Here was a woman calling out to the Great Spirit with the same desperation he had once felt, when his own wife and unborn child had perished during a cavalry raid on his village 5 winters ago. Ayanna watched as Margaret's shoulders shook with silent sobs, her blonde hair a stark contrast against the rough wooden interior of the chapel. In his culture, a woman's desire for children was considered sacred, a connection to the eternal cycle of life that the Apache revered above all else. The fact that this white woman prayed with such raw honesty, such genuine pain, stirred something in his warrior's heart that he had thought long dead. The desert had taught him patience, and so he waited, observing this strange ritual of grief and hope. Margaret's voice rose and fell like a lament, sometimes in English, sometimes in what sounded like Irish Gaelic, the language of her childhood before her family had crossed the ocean seeking a new life in America. She spoke of her husband Thomas, of their dreams of filling their small cabin with the laughter of children, of the nursery that remained empty and gathering dust. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Ayanna made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He stepped out from behind the cactus, his moccasined feet making no sound on the sandy ground, and approached the chapel with the fluid grace of a predator who had learned to move like the wind itself. Margaret's prayers continued, unaware that her words had summoned not just the attention of her Christian God, but also the ancient spirits of the land that had witnessed countless generations of Apache ceremonies and rituals. The warrior paused at the threshold of the chapel, his hand resting on the leather-wrapped handle of his knife, not in threat, but in the unconscious gesture of a man who had learned that survival often depended on being ready for anything. The wooden door creaked softly as a gust of wind pushed it open wider, and Margaret's voice faltered for a moment. She sensed a presence, a change in the very air around her, but she did not turn around. Instead, she closed her eyes tighter and continued her prayer, believing perhaps that God himself had finally come to answer her desperate plea. "Great Spirit," Ayanna whispered in his native tongue, so softly that Margaret could not hear him, "if this woman's heart calls to yours as mine once did, show me the path that leads to healing for us both." The chapel fell silent except for the sound of the wind through the wooden walls and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. In that moment, Two souls touched by loss and longing stood on the threshold of a destiny that neither could have imagined. Their separate griefs about to become intertwined in ways that would challenge everything they thought they knew about love, faith, and the mysterious workings of fate in the untamed American West. Margaret finally opened her eyes and turned around, her breath catching in her throat as she saw the tall, powerful figure silhouetted in the doorway. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Two people from different worlds frozen in a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, while the desert wind whispered secrets that only the ancient land could understand. The silence stretched between them like a taut bowstring, each heartbeat echoing in the small chapel, as Margaret's green eyes met the dark, penetrating gaze of the Apache warrior. Fear should have flooded through her veins, should have sent her scrambling for the small pistol Thomas had taught her to use, but instead she found herself strangely calm, as if this moment had been ordained by forces beyond her understanding. Ayanna stepped fully into the chapel, his tall frame filling the doorway before he moved with deliberate slowness toward the front pew. His long black hair was adorned with eagle feathers and small silver ornaments that caught the fading light, and his buckskin clothing was decorated with intricate beadwork that spoke of his status as a respected warrior. Despite his fearsome reputation among the white settlers, there was something in his eyes that Margaret recognized, a deep, abiding sorrow that mirrored her own. "You pray for children," he said in careful English, his voice deep and resonant like distant thunder. It was not a question but a statement, and Margaret felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment at being overheard in her most private moment of desperation. Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I pray for what God has denied me." Ayanna nodded slowly, understanding more than she could know. "My people believe that the Great Spirit hears all prayers, but sometimes the answer comes in ways we do not expect." He paused, studying her face with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see into her very soul. "I lost my wife and unborn child to the Bluecoats 5 winters ago. Since then, I have carried the same emptiness that I hear in your voice." Margaret's hand flew to her throat, shocked by his unexpected confession. Here was a man who was supposed to be her enemy, a savage according to the stories told in town, yet he spoke of loss with the same raw pain that consumed her every waking moment. "I'm sorry," she said softly, and meant it. "I know what it means to lose the one you love." "Your husband," Ayanna said, gesturing toward the simple wooden cross that dominated the front of the chapel. "He built this place for you." "Yes," Margaret replied, tears threatening to spill over again. "Thomas believed that if we prayed hard enough, God would bless us with children, but God seems to have forgotten us both." The Apache warrior moved closer, his movements fluid and purposeful. "Perhaps your God and my Great Spirit are the same, and perhaps they have not forgotten. Perhaps they have brought us together for a reason that neither of us yet understands." Margaret felt her heart racing, not from fear, but from something else entirely. A recognition that seemed to come from some primal part of her being that existed beyond the boundaries of race and culture. "What are you saying?" Ayanna stopped just a few feet away from her, close enough that she could see the intricate tattoos that adorned his chest and arms, symbols that told the story of his victories and losses, his connection to the natural world that surrounded them. "I am saying that the desert teaches us that life finds a way to bloom even in the harshest places. I am saying that two people who have known great loss might find in each other what they have been seeking alone." The implications of his words hung in the air between them like smoke from a sacred fire. Margaret knew that what he was suggesting was impossible, forbidden by every law and custom of her world. A white woman and an Apache warrior, such a union would be condemned by both their peoples, would make them outcasts in a land that was already unforgiving to those who dared to be different. Yet as she looked into his eyes, she saw not the savage that the townspeople feared, but a man whose heart had been broken just as hers had been, a man who understood the desperate longing for children that consumed her every thought. In his presence she felt something she had not experienced since Thomas's death, a sense of not being completely alone in the world. "My name is Margaret," she said finally, her voice stronger now. "Margaret O'Sullivan." "I am called Ayanna," he replied, inclining his head slightly in a gesture of respect. "It means eternal blossom in the language of my people." "Eternal blossom," Margaret repeated, tasting the foreign words on her tongue. "It's beautiful. Beauty can be found in the most unexpected places," Ayanna said, his eyes never leaving her face, "just as hope can be found in the darkest moments." Outside the chapel, the sun had nearly disappeared behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in deep purples and golds. The evening star appeared, bright and steady in the gathering darkness, as if the heavens themselves were bearing witness to this impossible meeting between two souls who had been shaped by loss and were now standing on the precipice of something that could either destroy them or make them whole. Margaret felt the weight of decision pressing down upon her like the vast sky above. She could send this man away, could return to her empty cabin and her empty prayers, could continue to live the half-life that had become her existence since Thomas's death, or she could take a step into the unknown, could trust in the strange certainty that seemed to flow between them like an underground river, could believe that perhaps the answer to her prayers had come in a form she had never imagined. The townspeople, she said quietly, voicing the fear that lurked at the edges of her consciousness, they would never understand. They would call me a traitor or worse. And my people would say I have been bewitched by a white woman's magic, Ayana replied. But the desert does not care about the opinions of men. The desert cares only about what is true, what is real, what serves the continuation of life. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her decision settling around her like a cloak. When she opened them again, she saw that Ayana had extended his hand toward her, palm up, in a gesture that was both invitation and question. His hand was scarred from countless battles, marked by the harsh life of a warrior, yet there was gentleness in the way he held it, as if he were offering her not just his touch but his protection, his strength, his willingness to face whatever consequences might come. The chapel seemed to hold its breath as Margaret reached out with trembling fingers and placed her hand in his. The moment their skin touched, she felt a jolt of recognition so powerful it nearly brought her to her knees. This was not the gentle, comfortable love she had shared with Thomas, but something wilder, more primal, a connection that seemed to bypass her mind entirely and speak directly to the deepest parts of her being. The path we choose will not be easy, Ayana said, his fingers closing gently around hers. There will be those who try to destroy what we build, but if you are willing to trust in something greater than fear, greater than the hatred that divides our peoples, then perhaps we can create the family that both our hearts have been crying out for. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. But for the first time in years, they were not tears of despair but of hope. Wild, impossible hope that maybe, just maybe, her prayers were about to be answered in the most unexpected way imaginable. The wind outside the chapel seemed to sing with approval, carrying with it the scent of rain and new growth, the promise that even in the desert, miracles could bloom. As the last light faded from the western sky and the first stars appeared overhead, Margaret O'Sullivan and Ayana stood together in the small wooden chapel, their hands joined, their hearts beginning to beat in rhythm with each other and with the ancient pulse of the land that surrounded them. They were about to embark on a journey that would test every belief they held dear, but in that moment, surrounded by the sacred silence of the desert night, they both felt the presence of something greater than themselves, blessing their unlikely union. The desert wind whispered through the chapel walls, carrying with it the voices of ancestors and the promises of generations yet to be born, as two souls who had been broken by loss began the slow, careful process of healing each other and creating something beautiful from the ashes of their separate griefs. In the days that followed their first meeting in the chapel, Margaret and Ayana began a courtship unlike any the frontier had ever witnessed. They met in secret, always at twilight when the desert came alive with the songs of coyotes and the rustle of creatures emerging from their daytime hiding places. Ayana would appear like a shadow at the edge of Margaret's property, and she would walk out to meet him, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and terror at the dangerous path they were choosing. Their conversations revealed the depth of understanding that had sparked between them in that first moment. Ayana told her of his childhood in the mountains, of learning to track deer and read the signs written in the movement of clouds across the sky. He spoke of his first wife, Itzel, whose name meant rainbow, and how she had died trying to bring their child into the world during a brutal winter, when his people were being hunted by the cavalry. Margaret shared her own story of crossing the ocean from Ireland as a child, of the potato famine that had driven her family from their homeland, of meeting Thomas at a church social in Santa Fe and believing that their love would be enough to overcome any obstacle. She told him about the miscarriages, 3 of them, each one taking a piece of her soul, until she began to believe that she was cursed, that God had marked her as unworthy of motherhood. In my culture, Ayana said one evening as they sat beside a small stream that ran through Margaret's property. We believe that some spirits are too powerful to be contained in a single lifetime. Perhaps the children who tried to come to you were meant for a different time, a different purpose. Margaret felt a strange comfort in his words, so different from the platitudes offered by the preacher in town who spoke of God's mysterious ways and the need for patience and acceptance. "Do you really believe that?" she asked. "I believe that everything happens for a reason, even if we cannot see that reason until much later," Ayana replied, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "I believe that my wife and child had to return to the spirit world so that I would be free to find you, and you had to endure your losses so that you would be ready to accept a love that comes from outside your world." As the weeks passed, their relationship deepened in ways that surprised them both. Ayana taught Margaret to read the signs of the desert, to identify the plants that could heal and those that could harm, to move silently through the brush without disturbing the delicate balance of life around them. Margaret shared with him the stories and songs of her Irish heritage, teaching him words in Gaelic and showing him how to tend the small garden that Thomas had planted behind their cabin. They discovered that their bodies spoke a language that transcended the barriers of culture and race. When Ayana kissed her for the first time, under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, Margaret felt as though she were being claimed not just by a man, but by the very spirit of the land itself. His touch awakened something wild and primal within her, something that had been sleeping since Thomas's death, something that responded to the warrior's strength and gentleness with an intensity that left her breathless. Their lovemaking was a revelation, a sacred act that seemed to bridge the gap between their two worlds. Ayana worshipped her body with the same reverence he showed for the natural world, treating each caress as a prayer, each kiss as a blessing. Margaret found herself responding with a passion she had never known existed within her, her body opening to him like a flower opening to the sun, welcoming him into the deepest parts of herself with a joy that bordered on the spiritual. But their secret could not remain hidden forever. The first sign of trouble came when Margaret's nearest neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, mentioned seeing strange tracks around Margaret's property. The older woman's eyes were sharp with suspicion as she spoke, and Margaret felt her heart sink with the knowledge that their time of peace was coming to an end. "You need to be careful, dear," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice dripping with false concern. "There have been reports of Apache raiders in the area. A woman alone like yourself. Well, you're vulnerable. Perhaps you should consider moving into town where you'd be safer." Margaret forced a smile and thanked her neighbor for the concern, but inside she was calculating how much time they might have before the truth was discovered. That evening, when Ayana appeared at their usual meeting place, she shared her fears with him. "They're starting to suspect," she said, her voice tight with worry. "It's only a matter of time before someone sees us together." Ayana nodded grimly. "I have heard whispers among my own people as well. Some of the young warriors have noticed my frequent absences, and there are those who would not understand my choice any more than your people would." "What do we do?" Margaret asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. "We have two choices," Ayana said, his voice steady despite the gravity of their situation. "We can end this now before it goes any further and return to our separate lives. Or we can commit fully to this path, knowing that it will mean leaving everything we have known behind." Margaret felt her heart breaking at the thought of losing him, but she also understood the magnitude of what he was asking. To choose him would mean abandoning her home, her community, everything that connected her to her late husband's memory. It would mean becoming an outcast, living on the margins of both worlds, never fully accepted by either. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw her future reflected there, not the safe, predictable future she had planned with Thomas, but something wild and uncertain and infinitely precious. She saw children with his dark eyes and her blonde hair, children who would grow up understanding both worlds, who would be living bridges between two cultures that had known only conflict. "I choose you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of the wind through the cottonwood trees. "I choose us, whatever the cost." Ayana pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could feel his heart beating against her chest. "Then we must leave soon," he said. "I know of a place in the mountains where we can be safe, where we can build a life together away from those who would destroy what we have found." "When?" Margaret asked, though part of her already knew. "Tomorrow night," Ayana replied. "Pack only what you cannot live without. We will travel light and fast, and we will not look back." Margaret nodded, feeling a mixture of terror and exhilaration coursing through her veins. Tomorrow night she would leave behind everything she had ever known and step into a future that was as uncertain as it was full of promise. She would become Margaret no more, but something new, something that had never existed before. A white woman who had chosen love over safety, passion over propriety, hope over fear. As they held each other under the vast canopy of stars, both Margaret and Ayanna felt the presence of something greater than themselves blessing their decision. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and wildflowers, the promise of rain and new growth, the ancient wisdom that taught that sometimes the greatest acts of courage required leaving everything familiar behind and trusting in the unknown. Tomorrow night, they would begin their journey into that unknown, carrying with them nothing but their love for each other and their shared dream of creating a family that would be a testament to the power of hope over hatred, of love over fear, of the human heart's infinite capacity to find light even in the darkest places. The night of their departure arrived with a storm brewing on the horizon, lightning flickering in the distance like the anger of the gods. Margaret had spent the day in a state of barely controlled panic, packing her few precious belongings while trying to maintain the appearance of normalcy. She chose only the essentials: her mother's wedding ring, the Bible Thomas had given her, a few pieces of clothing, and the small amount of money she had saved from selling eggs in town. As darkness fell, she made her way to the chapel one last time, kneeling before the wooden cross that Thomas had carved with his own hands. "Forgive me," she whispered, though she was no longer certain whether she was asking forgiveness from God, from Thomas's memory, or from herself. "I don't know if what I'm doing is right, but I know I cannot continue to live as I have been. If this is sin, then let me bear the consequences, but please let something good come from it." The wind howled through the chapel walls, and for a moment Margaret thought she heard Thomas's voice carried on the air, not angry or condemning, but gentle and understanding, as if he were giving her permission to seek the happiness that had been denied to them both. She touched the cross one last time, then rose and walked out into the storm. Ayanna was waiting for her at the edge of the property, his horse standing patiently beside him despite the wind and the approaching thunder. He had painted his face with traditional war paint, not for battle but for protection, the ancient symbols that would guard them on their journey into the unknown. When he saw her approaching with her small bundle of belongings, his eyes filled with an emotion so intense it took her breath away. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Once we leave, there will be no going back." "I'm certain," Margaret replied, and as she spoke the words, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. For the first time in years, she was choosing her own destiny rather than simply enduring whatever fate handed her. Ayanna helped her onto his horse, and she settled behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist, feeling the strength and warmth of his body against hers. As they rode away from the only home she had known as an adult, Margaret did not look back. Instead, she pressed her face against Ayanna's shoulder and let herself be carried forward into the storm. Trusting in his knowledge of the land and in the love that had brought them to this moment, they rode through the night, following paths that only Ayanna knew, ancient trails used by his people for generations to move unseen through the desert. The storm raged around them, but Margaret felt strangely protected, as if the very elements that should have been their enemy were instead providing cover for their escape. Lightning illuminated the landscape in brief, brilliant flashes, revealing a world that seemed both alien and beautiful, a world that would now be her home. As dawn broke, they reached a hidden canyon deep in the mountains, a place where a small stream provided fresh water, and the walls offered protection from both the elements and any who might pursue them. Ayanna had prepared a shelter here, a simple structure built in the Apache tradition, but modified with touches that showed his consideration for Margaret's comfort. A raised sleeping platform, a fire pit positioned to draw smoke away from their living space, storage areas for food and supplies. "This will be our home," he said as he helped her down from the horse, "at least until we can be certain that we are safe." Margaret looked around the canyon, taking in the stark beauty of the red rock walls, the small garden that Ayanna had already begun, the sense of peace that seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves. It was nothing like the life she had planned, nothing like the comfortable domesticity she had shared with Thomas, but it felt right in a way that surprised her. "It's perfect," she said, and meant it. In the days that followed, they began to build their life together in earnest. Ayana taught Margaret the skills she would need to survive in this harsh but beautiful environment. How to find water in the desert, how to identify edible plants, how to read the weather signs that could mean the difference between life and death. Margaret shared her own knowledge of cooking, sewing, and the domestic arts that would make their primitive shelter into a true home. But it was in the quiet moments, when they lay together under the vast canopy of stars, that their deepest connection was forged. They spoke of their dreams for the future, of the children they hoped to have, of the kind of life they wanted to build together. Ayana told her of his vision of a world where their children could move freely between both cultures, taking the best from each and helping to bridge the gap that had caused so much pain and bloodshed. "Our children will be something new," he said one night as they watched shooting stars streak across the sky. "They will carry the strength of the Apache and the determination of the Irish. They will be citizens of both worlds and prisoners of neither." Margaret felt a flutter in her belly as he spoke, a sensation that she had experienced before, but had always led to disappointment. This time, however, something felt different. This time the flutter was accompanied by a deep certainty that seemed to come from the very core of her being. "Ayana," she whispered, her hand moving to her stomach. I think it's happening." He turned to her, his eyes wide with understanding and hope. "You are certain?" "Not certain," Margaret admitted, "but hopeful. More hopeful than I have been in years." Ayana placed his hand over hers, and they both felt it. A tiny flutter of life, a spark of possibility that seemed to glow in the darkness like a star being born. For a moment, neither of them dared to breathe, afraid that acknowledging the miracle might somehow cause it to disappear. But the flutter came again, stronger this time, and Margaret felt tears of joy streaming down her face. After years of emptiness, after countless prayers that seemed to go unanswered, life was finally taking root within her. The child she had dreamed of, prayed for, begged God to give her, was finally becoming real. "Our eternal blossom," Ayana whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "The first of many." As they held each other in the darkness, surrounded by the ancient silence of the mountains, Margaret felt a peace settle over her that she had never known before. She had lost everything she thought she wanted, had abandoned everything she thought she needed, but in return she had found something infinitely more precious, a love that transcended all boundaries, a partner who understood her deepest longings, and now, finally, the promise of the family she had always dreamed of. The desert wind sang through the canyon walls, carrying with it the voices of all the generations that had come before and all those yet to be born. In that moment, Margaret understood that her prayers had been answered after all, just not in the way she had expected. Sometimes the greatest blessings came disguised as the greatest risks, and sometimes the path to everything you had ever wanted led through territory you had never imagined exploring. As she drifted off to sleep in Ayana's arms, Margaret whispered a prayer of gratitude to whatever force had brought them together, whether it was the Christian God of her childhood, the great spirit of Ayana's people, or simply the mysterious power of love itself. For the first time in years, she was not asking for something she lacked, but giving thanks for something she had found. The months that followed were the happiest of Margaret's life, despite the challenges of their isolated existence. As her pregnancy progressed, Ayana proved to be the most attentive and caring partner she could have imagined. He gathered special herbs to ease her morning sickness, crafted comfortable furniture for their growing home, and spent hours talking to their unborn child, telling stories in both English and Apache, singing traditional songs that had been passed down through generations of his people. Margaret's body bloomed with new life in ways that amazed them both. Unlike her previous pregnancies, which had been marked by constant worry and eventual loss, this one felt strong and sure from the very beginning. The child moved vigorously within her, as if eager to enter the world and begin the adventure of bridging two cultures. Margaret found herself laughing more than she had in years, her natural joy returning as her body fulfilled its deepest purpose. They had been living in the canyon for nearly 6 months when the first signs of trouble appeared. Ayana returned from a hunting trip with news that made Margaret's blood run cold. A cavalry patrol had been asking questions in the nearby settlements, showing a sketch of a blonde woman and offering a reward for information about her whereabouts. "They say you were kidnapped," Ayana reported, his face grim. "Mrs. Henderson has convinced the authorities that I took you against your will. They are organizing a search party." Margaret felt her protective instincts flare as she placed her hands over her swollen belly. They can't take me back, she said fiercely. I won't let them separate us, and I won't let them take our child. They will not take you, Ayana promised, his voice carrying the deadly certainty of a warrior who had never lost a battle he was determined to win. But we must be prepared to defend what we have built here. The next few days were tense with preparation and planning. Ayana showed Margaret the hidden paths that led out of the canyon, the secret places where she could hide if necessary, the signals they would use to communicate if they were separated. He also began teaching her to use the rifle he had acquired, though he hoped it would never come to that. But their preparations proved insufficient when the attack came. It was not the cavalry that found them first, but a group of Apache warriors led by Ayana's own brother Nalnish, who had been tracking him for weeks. The confrontation was swift and brutal, not a battle between enemies, but a family dispute that cut deeper than any wound inflicted by strangers. You have brought shame upon our people, Nalnish declared as he faced his brother across the small clearing where Margaret tended her garden. You have forgotten who you are, forgotten the blood of our ancestors that flows in your veins. I have forgotten nothing, Ayana replied, his hand resting on the handle of his knife. I have found something that our people have lost, the ability to see beyond the hatred that has poisoned both our worlds. The argument that followed was conducted in rapid Apache, but Margaret could understand enough to know that Ayana was being given an ultimatum: abandon the white woman and return to his people, or be cast out forever as a traitor to his own blood. She watched in horror as the two brothers who had once been inseparable faced each other with the bitter animosity of mortal enemies. Choose, Nalnish said finally, switching to English so that Margaret could understand. Your people or this woman? You cannot have both. Ayana looked at Margaret, his eyes filled with pain but also with unwavering determination. I have already chosen, he said quietly. I choose love over hatred, hope over despair, the future over the past. If that makes me a traitor, then I accept that judgment. Nalnish's face twisted with rage and grief. Then you are no longer my brother, he spat. You are dead to us, dead to the memory of our father and the honor of our clan. When the cavalry comes for you, do not expect help from those whose blood you have betrayed. As quickly as they had appeared, the Apache warriors melted back into the desert, leaving Margaret and Ayana alone with the knowledge that they had now been abandoned by both their peoples. That night, as they held each other in their small shelter, both of them wept, not for themselves, but for the pain they had caused others, for the bridges they had been forced to burn in order to build their own happiness. Do you regret it? Margaret asked, her voice barely a whisper in the darkness. Never, Ayana replied without hesitation. Our love is worth any price, and our child will be proof that there is another way, a better way, than the endless cycle of hatred and revenge. But their trials were far from over. 3 days later, the cavalry arrived, led by Captain Morrison, a man whose hatred for the Apache was legendary throughout the territory. Margaret watched from her hiding place in the rocks as the soldiers surrounded their canyon, their rifles gleaming in the morning sun, their faces set with the grim determination of men who believed they were on a mission of rescue. Margaret O'Sullivan, Captain Morrison called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. We know you're in there. We've come to take you home, to safety. You don't have to be afraid anymore. Margaret felt her heart breaking as she realized that these men, who thought they were saving her, would never understand that she was exactly where she wanted to be. They saw only a white woman who had been corrupted by a savage, not a woman who had found the love of her life and was carrying his child. Ayana appeared at the mouth of the canyon, his hands raised but his posture proud and unafraid. She is not your prisoner, he called out. She is my wife and she carries my child. We have harmed no one. We ask only to be left in peace. You lying savage, Captain Morrison snarled, raising his rifle. No decent white woman would willingly consort with your kind. Release her now, or we'll take her by force. I am not his prisoner, Margaret cried out, emerging from her hiding place despite Ayana's frantic gestures for her to stay hidden. I am here by choice, by love, by my own free will. The sight of her obviously pregnant form sent a ripple of shock through the assembled soldiers. Captain Morrison's face went white with rage as he realized the implications of what he was seeing. You've defiled her, he whispered, his voice thick with disgust. You've corrupted a good Christian woman and filled her with your heathen spawn. Our child is a blessing, Margaret said, her voice ringing with conviction as she moved to stand beside Ayana, A bridge between two worlds. A symbol of what could be possible if people like you would stop choosing hatred over understanding. There will be no half-breed bastards born in this territory, Captain Morrison declared, his finger tightening on the trigger of his rifle. Not while I draw breath. What happened next would be remembered in the oral histories of both peoples for generations to come. As Captain Morrison raised his rifle to fire, Ayanna threw himself in front of Margaret, taking the bullet that was meant for her. As he fell, Margaret's anguished scream echoed through the canyon like the cry of a wounded eagle, and something primal and fierce awakened within her. The other soldiers hesitated, shocked by their captain's brutality, and in that moment of uncertainty, Margaret did something that no one expected. She picked up Ayanna's rifle and pointed it directly at Captain Morrison's heart. "You will not take my husband," she said, her voice deadly calm despite the tears streaming down her face. "You will not take my child. You will leave this place now, or I will kill you where you stand." The standoff lasted for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Margaret, 8 months pregnant and grieving for her wounded husband, faced down an entire cavalry patrol with nothing but her determination and her love. Behind her, Ayanna struggled to his feet, the bullet having passed through his shoulder without hitting anything vital, his own rifle now trained on the soldiers who had come to rescue his wife. It was one of the younger soldiers who finally broke the tension. "Captain," he said quietly, "maybe we should go. She doesn't look like she needs rescuing to me." Captain Morrison's face was purple with rage, but he could see that his men were losing their stomach for what he wanted to do. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered his rifle. "This isn't over," he snarled. "You can't hide in these mountains forever. Someday you'll have to come down, and when you do, we'll be waiting." "Then you'll be waiting a very long time," Margaret replied, her rifle never wavering. "Because this is our home now, and we will defend it with our lives." As the cavalry retreated, Margaret and Ayanna collapsed into each other's arms, both of them shaking with the aftermath of violence and the knowledge of how close they had come to losing everything. But they had survived, and their love had proven stronger than the hatred that sought to destroy it. That night, as Ayanna's wound healed under Margaret's careful ministrations, they felt their child moving restlessly within her womb, as if the little one had sensed the danger and was eager to be born into a world where such courage and love were possible. "Our child will be strong," Ayanna whispered, his hand resting on Margaret's belly. "Strong enough to face whatever challenges await, strong enough to build the bridges that we have only dreamed of." "Yes," Margaret agreed, feeling the baby's powerful kicks against her ribs. "Our eternal blossom, ready to bloom in the desert and show the world that love is always stronger than hate." As the stars wheeled overhead and the desert wind sang its ancient songs, Margaret and Ayanna held each other close, knowing that their greatest trial was behind them, and their greatest joy was yet to come. They had chosen love over fear, hope over despair, and now they would reap the rewards of that choice in the form of a child who would be living proof that miracles could indeed bloom in the most unlikely places. The birth came with the spring rains, as if the earth itself was celebrating the arrival of this long-awaited child. Margaret's labor was long, but not difficult, attended by Ayanna, and guided by the ancient wisdom he had learned from the medicine women of his tribe. As the first light of dawn broke over the canyon walls, their daughter entered the world with a cry that seemed to echo off the rocks like a song of triumph. She was perfect, a beautiful blend of both her parents, with Margaret's green eyes and Ayanna's dark hair, skin the color of honey, and a spirit that seemed to glow from within. They named her Saoirse, which meant freedom, in Margaret's native Gaelic, and Ayanna added the Apache name Desba, meaning goes to war, for he could see in her eyes the fierce determination that would serve her well in the world they were creating for her. "She is everything we dreamed of and more," Margaret whispered as she held their daughter for the first time, tears of joy streaming down her face. "She is proof that love can conquer anything." Ayanna touched his daughter's tiny hand with one finger, marveling at the perfection of her miniature features. "She will grow up knowing both worlds," he said softly. "She will speak the languages of both her peoples, understand the wisdom of both traditions, and perhaps she will be the one to finally build the bridge that we have only begun." In the months that followed, their little family flourished in their hidden canyon. Saoirse grew strong and healthy, delighting them both with her quick intelligence and fearless curiosity. Margaret taught her Irish lullabies and stories of the old country, while Ayana shared the legends of his people and the skills needed to survive in the desert. The child seemed to absorb everything like a sponge, switching effortlessly between languages and showing an intuitive understanding of both cultures that amazed her parents. Word of their survival and the birth of their child spread through both communities, carried by traders and travelers who had glimpsed them during their rare trips to gather supplies. Some spoke of them with disgust and condemnation, but others whispered of them with something approaching awe. A white woman and an Apache warrior who had defied every law and custom to create something beautiful and new. As Saoirse grew from infant to toddler, Margaret found herself pregnant again, and then again. Each pregnancy was easier than the last, as if her body had finally found its true purpose. Their son Kian was born 2 years after Saoirse, followed by twin daughters Neve and Awifa. Each child was unique, but all carried the same blend of strength and gentleness that marked them as the children of two worlds. The canyon that had once been a hiding place became a true home, expanded and improved over the years to accommodate their growing family. Ayana built additional rooms carved into the rock walls, created terraced gardens that provided fresh vegetables year-round, and established a small herd of horses that roamed the hidden valley beyond their canyon. Margaret established a school of sorts, teaching not only her own children, but also the occasional Apache child whose parents were curious about the white woman's knowledge, and the rare settler child whose family was brave enough to seek out the legendary couple. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about their life was the way it began to attract others, outcasts and misfits from both cultures, who found in Margaret and Ayana's example the courage to forge their own unconventional paths. A Mexican vaquero who had fallen in love with a Navajo woman brought his family to live nearby. A former slave who had escaped to the frontier and married a Apache woman sought their protection and guidance. A white missionary who had lost his faith but found something deeper in the desert wisdom came to learn from Ayana's spiritual teachings. Slowly, carefully, they began to build something that had never existed before. A community where race and culture mattered less than character and courage, where children grew up speaking multiple languages and understanding multiple ways of seeing the world, where the old hatreds were replaced by new possibilities. Margaret often thought of the prayer she had whispered in that little wooden chapel so many years ago, "Make me a mother, God," and marveled at how completely and unexpectedly it had been answered. She had become not just a mother to her own children, but a mother figure to an entire community of people who had been rejected by the conventional world. Her home had become a sanctuary for those who dared to love across the boundaries that others insisted were sacred and immutable. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and she and Ayana sat together watching the stars, Margaret would sometimes feel the presence of Thomas, not as a reproach but as a blessing, as if her first husband's spirit approved of the happiness she had found and the family she had created. She had learned that love was not a finite resource, that honoring one love did not diminish another, and that the heart was capable of expanding to hold more joy than she had ever imagined possible. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had never met?" she asked Ayana one night as they watched their children sleeping peacefully in their beds. "Never," he replied without hesitation. "I believe that we were always meant to find each other, that every step of our separate journeys was leading us to that moment in the chapel when our destinies became one." Margaret smiled, thinking of the desperate woman who had knelt in that chapel begging God for a child, never imagining that her prayer would be answered by an Apache warrior who would give her not just one child but many, not just a family, but a community, not just love, but a purpose that would echo through generations. As the years passed and their children grew into strong, confident young people who moved easily between worlds, Margaret and Ayana's story became legend. Some told it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of crossing racial boundaries, but others spoke of it as proof that love could indeed conquer all, that courage and determination could create new possibilities even in the most unlikely circumstances. Their eldest daughter, Saoirse, grew up to become a translator and mediator, helping to negotiate peace treaties between the Apache and the territorial government. Their son, Kian, became a doctor, combining traditional Apache healing methods with modern medicine to serve both communities. The twins, Neve and Awifa, established a school that welcomed children of all backgrounds and taught them to see their differences as strengths rather than divisions. And in the small wooden chapel that still stood on Margaret's old homestead, now tended by a Mexican family who had heard the story and wanted to preserve the place where it all began, Visitors would sometimes report hearing the sound of prayers being answered, of dreams taking flight, of love triumphant over all the forces that sought to destroy it. Margaret O'Sullivan and Ayanna had asked for a child and been given a legacy. They had sought personal happiness and created social change. They had defied the expectations of their time and place to prove that the human heart, when guided by love rather than fear, was capable of miracles that could transform not just individual lives but entire communities. Their story became a testament to the power of hope over despair, of courage over conformity, of love over hatred. In a land torn by conflict and division, they had created an oasis of peace and understanding that would endure long after they were gone, a living proof that sometimes the most impossible dreams were simply waiting for someone brave enough to make them real. As Margaret held her newest grandchild in her arms, watching Saoirse tend to her own family with the same fierce love that had sustained them all through the years, she whispered a prayer of gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had asked God to make her a mother, and He had made her so much more: a bridge builder, a peacemaker, a woman whose love had changed the world in ways both small and profound. The desert wind sang through the canyon walls, carrying with it the voices of all those who had been touched by their story, all those who had found the courage to love beyond boundaries, because Margaret and Ayanna had shown them it was possible. Their eternal blossom had indeed bloomed in the desert, and its seeds had scattered on the wind to take root in hearts and minds across the frontier, creating a garden of hope that would flourish for generations to come.